Good morning. It's nice to be here. Are y'all ready for a big history lesson? That's what we've got, chocked full of information. So I have some slides to go along with the sermon today as well. So hopefully there'll be some visuals to help us understand what's going on in the 3rd and 4th century. So today is our second Sunday looking at the history of the church, and last week Chad gave us an overview of the Christian church from the disciples and the apostles right through until present day. We were going to have a handout for you. I'm really sorry we forgot to pick it up from the printer on Friday, but we will have it next week for you, and that'll give you the whole timeline right through from the disciples till today, all the details included. So we'll definitely have that for you next week. But today, we pick up our story at the end of the Diocletian persecution of the early church in 306 AD. So from the time of Christ's ascension until the start of the 3rd century, the Christian church had been under persecution. And the Diocletian persecution was the cruelest persecution the ancient church had to endure. Christians were tortured and removed from government positions. Churches were destroyed and sacred texts were burned. Fires in the royal palaces were blamed on Christians, and they were maimed and set to work in stone quarries. Roman Emperor Diocletian declared that all Christians working in the palace had to offer sacrifices before the Roman gods. And interestingly enough, his wife and daughter, so his wife Prisca and his daughter Valeria, were Christians. And his wife and daughter eventually complied with his wishes to offer sacrifices to the Roman gods, but many others were martyred for not complying. And many Christians found it so difficult they succumbed to the pressures of the empire, and the rest who stood firm were tortured and killed in a variety of ways. But when all seemed lost, one of the Roman leaders under Diocletian became ill with a painful disease. And he began to think that the Christian God was punishing him for torturing the Christians. So he convinced Diocletian to change the policy against Christians. And in 311, Diocletian declared this: "Moved by our mercy to be benevolent towards all, it has seemed just to extend to them our pardon and allow them to be Christians once again, and once again gather in their assemblies, as long as they do not interfere with public order. And in return for our tolerance, Christians will be required to pray to their gods for us, for the public good and for themselves, so that the state may enjoy prosperity and they may live in peace." So that was a big deal. Following the end of the great persecution, one of the Roman leaders made a play for more territory. This ruler was Constantine. He managed, through a surprise attack, to take over the entire western half of the Roman Empire. And the night before the battle that made him the victor of the West, he saw a vision in the sky with the words, "In this you shall conquer." So in the morning, he instructed his soldiers to place the Greek letters Cairo, I'm not very good with my Greek, Cairo on their shields and their standards. These letters are the first 2 letters of the Greek name for Christ. Some scholars say this is Constantine's conversion moment. Others say it is just the beginning of a much longer conversion story. In 313, Constantine, emperor of the West, and Licinius, emperor of the East, meet to form an alliance. As part of the alliance, it is agreed that persecution of the church would cease. Their churches, cemeteries, and other properties would be returned to them. This agreement is commonly known as the Edict of Milan. And for a while, there was peace between Constantine and Licinius. But in truth, the ambitions of both men were far too big to allow them to rule one empire together. Christianity in Licinius' territory was divided over a number of issues, and some of the Christians felt wronged by their leader. They began to see Constantine as the defender of the true faith and as the emperor whom God loved. And finally, in 322, Constantine invaded Licinius's territories, and after a long, bloody battle, he took the east in 324, thus making him sole emperor of the Roman Empire. I think we have a slide to show the Roman Empire. Yes, so there we go. So all of this territory, the entire west and the entire east, is now under the rule of Constantine. And so for the first time, the entire Roman Empire is united under a Christian leader. So persecution had come to an end, and peace was achieved. But the church was yet to discover a new threat in the 3rd and 4th century. Constantine is a big deal. His impact on the church could be felt for more than 1,000 years. Many aspects of organized church structure point to his influences, from the shape of the first basilica, which is on our next slide. So here is the Basilica of Constantine and Maxentius. And so that's the initial floor plan for that basilica, and the ruins that you see on the left are what's left of that very first Roman basilica. We learned from exploring Bible knowledge that it started as an open area in Roman times and was used as a public gathering space. But this was the first building that was constructed as a church under Roman rule. So from the shape of the first basilica to the procession that you often see in a liturgical church at the beginning, where the priest would walk down and the altar boys would walk down the center, all of that began. The burning of incense also began at this time, which was originally used as a sign of respect for the emperor, including the lavish garments that all the priests and church officials wore. That is when this started to happen. Before then, priests wore very, very simple clothing. And congregations became less active participants in the services, more like onlookers, more like what we see today in many churches. And inside the basilicas, Christ was often depicted in tiled wall mosaics, sometimes with the Virgin Mary as an infant, or seated on a throne in the style of a Roman emperor. Communion was still the central act of worship, celebrated every Sunday, and baptism was by immersion and naked. So there was a large sheet partitioning the baptistry. So there was a men's side and there was a women's side. You would go in naked and you would come out naked, cleansed, and you were given a white robe to wear when you came out as a symbol of your cleanliness now and your new life. As early as the 2nd century, it became customary to celebrate the deaths of martyrs at the spot where they were buried. And often churches were built on the bones of a martyr, or sometimes a martyr's bones were dug up and moved to a new church building and placed under the altar. Some Christians claimed revelations of martyrs, and eventually the relics of saints and martyrs were said to have miraculous powers. Empress Helena, Constantine's mother, advocated for this practice when on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. She thought she had discovered the cross of Christ. Soon the wood was said to have miraculous powers, and pieces of it were claimed to be found all over the empire. The ancient church continued in its traditional customs, such as baptism and communion. But changes brought about by this new situation could be seen everywhere and were unsettling for some Christians. Church historian Justo L. Gonzalez writes, "The great question the church faced at this time was to what degree and how it should adapt to the changed circumstances. All were agreed that some measure of adaptation was necessary. All were also agreed that such adaptation should not relinquish the traditional faith of the church. The disagreement rested on exactly what it meant to be obedient in a new age while remaining faithful to the old message." The church grew so rapidly at this time, there was little time to prepare new Christians for baptism and less time to guide them in the new Christian life once they had been baptized. But even although masses came into the faith, it seemed that many did so for the positions of privilege and power it often offered, without caring to delve too deeply into the meaning of baptism and life under the cross. Bishops competed for prestigious position, taxes grew, and the wealthy dominated the church. For almost 300 years, the church had lived under persecution. It was a faith born of a lowly carpenter, led by uneducated fishermen and outcasts. Many in the church were convinced that opulence and security were the greatest enemies of the church. How was one to be a true Christian when the church had joined the powers of the world? When luxury and ostentation had taken hold of the Christian altars? How was one to witness to the crucified Christ who had nowhere to lay his head, when many church leaders lived in very costly homes? Many Christians found the answer in the monastic way of life and chose to flee from human society, thus beginning the monastic movement. Monasticism had roots both within and outside of the church. For those within, monasticism was inspired by the Apostle Paul's words that those who chose not to marry had greater freedom to serve the Lord. Couple this with the ever-present thought of Christ's return. Why invest in a routine and sedentary life when Christ could be coming back at any moment? Outside the church, classical philosophy held that the body was the prison of the soul, and passions of the body were the greatest enemy of wisdom. This is Stoic philosophy, and it focused on perfecting the soul, pushing down and controlling bodily passions. So although there were early monastics across the empire, the real growth of the monastic movement took place in the desert, especially the Egyptian desert. And the word monk derives from the Greek monakos, which means solitary or solitude. And solitude is what the first desert fathers and mothers, or monks, sought. They wanted to be alone with God. They were not in agreement with how the church was playing out as an accepted part of the Roman Empire. Many had anticipated being martyred and felt that the only way to navigate this new life was to withdraw from society to the desert, to be alone with God, subdue the bodily desires raging in them for a life of ease and comfort. And while there were thousands of Christians fleeing to the desert, men and women alike, Anthony of Egypt, or Anthony the Great, who we have a slide of, is perhaps the most well-known of all desert fathers and mothers. During the Diocletian persecution, he heard a Sunday sermon stating that perfection could be achieved by selling all of one's possessions, giving the proceeds to the poor, and following Christ. This is from the text Matthew 19, verse 21. He followed the advice and made the further step of moving deep into the desert to seek complete solitude. The solitude, austerity, and sacrifice of the desert was seen by Anthony as an alternative to martyrdom, which was, to the early church, the highest form of sacrifice. Anthony quickly gained followers eager to learn from him how to live their lives in accordance with solidarity and separation from material goods. Anthony is credited with receiving special privileges from God, such as the ability to heal the sick, inspire others to have faith in healing through God, and even converse with God on occasion. Another interesting desert father is Simeon Stylites, who lived on a pillar 60 feet tall for 30 years. We have a photo. Oh, I think we've got a slide of him too. So, lived on a pillar 60 feet tall for 30 years. And this pillar was found in the ruins of an old temple. He fasted on the pillar and preached twice a day from the pillar. His preaching was sincere and practical, and although he was clearly psychologically unstable, he was devoted to God. Finally, his skin could not take the weather anymore, and he developed wounds that became infested with maggots. He died at 69 years of age on the pillar. And of course, there are many desert mothers in the mix. According to Athanasius, one of the two Christian writers to record the lives of the desert fathers and mothers, there were many, many people moving to the desert. And Athanasius records that maybe this is a bit exaggerated, he says, but upwards of 20,000 women and 10,000 men were living in one area of the Egyptian desert. And some travelers visiting the area joked that the desert was more populated than the cities. Athanasius records that in his notes. Anyway, Synclectica of Alexandria, one of our more well-known desert mothers, was of a wealthy background and is reputed to have been very beautiful. From her childhood, however, Synclectica was drawn to God and the desire to dedicate her life to him. So from the time she gained responsibility for her family's affairs, after the death of her parents, she gave all that she had been left to the poor. And with her younger sister, Synclectica abandoned the life of the city and chose to reside in a crypt, adopting the life of a hermit. Her holy life soon gained the attention of locals, and gradually many women came to live as her disciples in Christ. There she is, Desert Mother Synclectica. Over time, the model of Anthony and other hermits attracted many followers. Some lived alone in the desert and others in small groups. They chose a life of extreme asceticism, renouncing all the pleasures of the senses, rich food, baths, rest, anything that made them comfortable. They instead focused their energies on praying, singing psalms, fasting, giving alms to the needy, and preserving love and harmony with one another while keeping their thoughts and desires for God alone. Eventually, under the direction of a monk named Pachomius, communal monasticism blossomed. Pachomius was a desert father seeking solitude along with all the other fathers and mothers. But God gave him a repeated vision to serve humankind. So he built a large enclosure and invited his followers to join him. Those in the commune were asked to give up all possessions and obey their superiors. Everyone would work with their hands, and none would be allowed to consider any task unworthy of them. Thus, the first monasteries were born. Religious seekers and even priests and bishops began going to the desert, seeking advice and counsel from the early desert fathers. It was, in fact, the church leaders who most contributed to the spread of monasticism. They found the value in the monastic life to be a great witness for the daily life of the church and did all they could to promote this way of life. There are so many monks and church fathers who were influential in the 3rd and 4th century. Maybe you have heard of some of them. I'm just going to list a couple, and we have some visuals to go along with them. The first one is Saint Martin, a monk who was elected to become the Bishop of Tours in France. Upon being made bishop, he built a small cell beside the cathedral where he would devoted all his free time to the monastic life. He chose not to live in the bishop's palace. He lived in a cell beside the church. Athanasius of Alexandria, who was dragged out of hiding in the desert in order to be made Bishop of Alexandria. He worked his whole life to teach that Jesus is God, and because he came to us on earth, we are free to be what God intends us to be, beings capable of living in communion with the divine. Athanasius was a key player in the Arian controversy, which I'm thinking Chad might address next week. There's also Basil of Caesarea, known as Basil the Great, Ambrose of Milan, and John Chrysostom, affectionately called the golden-mouthed preacher, who became the Bishop of Constantinople. He imposed many great reforms within the life of the clergy, including selling luxury items adorning the bishop's palace and giving the money to feed the hungry and the poor. He also attacked the sexual purity of the priests, priests who claimed to be celibate, but had in their homes what they called spiritual sisters. Or the stormy and feisty Saint Jerome of Italy. And of course, the most influential theologian in the entire Latin-speaking church since New Testament times, Augustine from North Africa. Augustine was trained in the art of rhetoric and argumentation, and he had many, many problems with Christianity, primarily its sacred text. He found the Bible to be a series of inelegant writings, some even barbaric, in which the rules of good style were seldom followed, and where one found crude episodes of violence, rape, deceit, and the like. His second issue was with the question of the origins of evil. Augustine struggled many years with Christianity before he finally converted and embraced the life of a monastic. He later became the Bishop of Hippo, which is modern-day Algeria. Now, I could go on and on, as there are so many fascinating characters to look at, but we'll have to save them for another Sunday. As we come to our conclusion today, we have seen the church go through 3 distinct stages in the span of 1 century. First, persecution, and the worst the church has ever seen. Second, they've come into a phase of the Imperial church with all its ease and luxury. And third, we have seen them move into a stage of monasticism, the severe reaction to the life of opulence, as thousands flee to the desert to live an austere, ascetic life. So on the one hand, we have this completely Christian empire, a national church where everyone is welcome and expected to participate. There's no fear to embrace the faith, and there's harmony among believers. It's a time of safety and peace. I mean, doesn't that sound good? Aren't we all happy to live in a country where religious freedom is not in question? The church perceived this as a blessing from God, as a sign that they were following the true faith. Constantine was God's man uniting the empire. Why then did so many flee to the desert? Were they all just crazy? Or did they feel that the true essence of faith had been lost? Too much attention was being paid to position and station, building expensive churches and homes for the clergy, fascination with relics and lavish garments. These are 2 extreme positions. And I'm not sure we can rightly look at one or the other and say it is a balanced view of a vibrant and active faith-living church. Nor can we cast them off as flawed images of the church, as there's much to learn from the churches through the centuries and from the many faithful servants in the church. Let's face it, the church hasn't changed much over the centuries. Don't we now have wealthy churches in wealthy states, poor churches, and churches that meet in secret so they don't face persecution from their governments? Isn't the challenge of Christians today to follow Christ in whatever situation we are placed? Whether we are wealthy or poor, live lavish lives or lives of hardship, self-inflicted or otherwise? Christ is available to all of us, regardless of our situation. And as we work out our faith to the best of our ability, he is there, walking alongside us, meeting us where we are, calling us to look beyond our situation, calling us to look inside to what is going on in our hearts. And so I challenge you today to take all of these pieces that you've learned and mull them over and consider all the pieces that have gone on over the centuries. How does that apply to your life today? What does your inside look like? I hope you've enjoyed this taste of the 3rd century. Next week, we will hear more from Chad. He's going to go into the creeds and more on the theology side and look at some of the writings of the theologians around the same time and a little bit into the 4th century as well. Thank you.